fought again for France in World War II. And I have to say that I'm very proud to be the daughter of a man who was with General de Gaulle when Eugene Bullitt received his Legion of Honor in New York in the early 1960s. So I have a special, so you will not see me advertise one memorial over the next. I think both of them need to be well funded and to come in existence quickly. So let me speak to you about the commemoration. As you know, the Americans entered the war in April 1917. We had a major event in Kansas City where the World War I Memorial is and where the other National Memorial is located. Why Kansas City? You all know the role of Kansas City, which was for the train, the Atlanta of the airplane time. So the first major commemoration we commemorate where at the end of May for the first American offensive in the Marne Cemetery at Belleau Woods and also at Cantigny. Then we had, in fact, as part of our commemoration, we had a group of student ambassadors, among them a group that came from, one who came from Georgia, who were invited to attend those ceremonies and to spend time learning about the French battlefield. Then, sorry. I think my finger doesn't work well with your with your button. Then we commemorated the second Battle of the Marne. Here you see the Oise Cemetery, the second largest World War I cemetery in France. You see we had a parade in the city of Ferrand-Tardenois. You can see General Lengyel on the Joint Chief of Staff. This whole second Battle of the Marne was commemorated by a large contingent of young National Guard soldiers from the various units with a legacy in the unit who fought during the second Battle of the Marne. And they were accompanied by their respective commanders. So General Lengyel was there as the head of the National Guard Bureau. And then we went to see this memorial to the Rainbow Division, the 42nd Division, which brought to France in October 1917 units from 26 states and the District of Columbia. It was a creation of MacArthur. He thought that it would be a great idea to be able for 26 states in the nation to say, we have our men already in France. We had later, in early August, the commemoration of the Second Battle of the Somme. And you can see here the Flanders Field cemetery in Belgium. And also we had a major ceremony with the British in the Cathedral of Amiens. There in Amiens, we had high school students coming from France, Germany, the United States, Canada, and Australia, who spent 5 days touring battlefields and learning about battlefield. And here you have the quote from a young student from Michigan who was with 5 of her other school students. Then we had the commemoration of the Battle of Saint-Mihiel and Meuse-Argonne in the Thiaucourt Cemetery and also in front of the Montsec Memorial, where you see a series at the bottom in front of Montsec. You see a series of commissioners, as well as Colonel Jennifer Pritzker, who has been the major sponsor of the commission, and Colonel York, the grandson of Sergeant York. And here the commissioners are in front of the Côte de Châtillon, which was captured in October 1918 by Douglas MacArthur and his 84th Brigade of Iowa and Alabamian soldiers. The next day was the commemoration of the Meuse-Argonne battle. This is the largest American cemetery in Europe. And I keep insisting about this because I always get shocked when I hear Americans saying we are going to see the battlefields, we are going to Normandy where our cemeteries are, with complete ignorance that this cemetery in Meuse-Argonne is larger than the cemetery in Normandy. So I was so pleased, we were so pleased at the commission that this photograph made it to the front page of the Wall Street Journal on the Monday morning on the 24th of September. This happened on the 23rd of September. We also that night had a luminary where those 16,000 tombs were had a candle on them. And during 24 hours, the name of all the soldiers who rest in this cemetery were read by young people. And it was an incredibly moving ceremony. While we were commemorating Meuse-Argonne, and this is just one example I want to give you of what the French have been doing to honor the Americans. But those are multiple. Every single one of this event was accompanied by major demonstration of respect and gratitude from the French people. Here you have an American Remembrance Trail, which was created by the French National Office of Forestry, and whose major, I have sort of located the area here on this map, and you have an orientation table where you can dominate the whole battlefield of Meuse-Argonne. You have also, you see, coat of arms plantation. The French National Office of Forestry has had a group of high school students, French high school students, plant 1,700 trees, sequoias, Douglas fir, and red oaks, in memory of the 1,700 soldiers of the 1st Division who died in those woods. So this coat of arms is now growing. We had the soldier of the 1st Division visit, and you can see now the trees are small. You can see the young trees by the feet, or you can see them back there by the feet of the soldiers. There you have this plantation, you have the orientation table on top, and here there is a plaque to Douglas MacArthur. And we had over those commemoration units from the 35th Division who started that offensive towards the Côte de Châtillon, from the 1st Division, from the 42nd Division that visited this site, each time with representative of the French Office of Forestry, which you see there in the middle of the picture. This is to give you a feeling why, for those gentlemen and ladies working in the French National Office of Forestry, this is so important. When they look after those trees here at the bottom, you see a stump, and then you see a big tree. The one to the far right of the screen. The stump is a stump of a tree that was shot down by machine gun fire during World War I. The big tree that has grown out of it is a 100-year-old tree that grew out of that stump destroyed by artillery fire during World War I. So those forestry people live with those trees who still have shells inside of them, machine guns, barbed wire. The trees are all there, but also there are the bodies of all the soldiers, German and Americans, who have not been recovered. And so this tree, in fact, is a shroud forest. And it is in itself a place very much respected by the French who work in those woods. And here I was mentioning the body of those soldiers. They are buried in American cemetery, they are buried in French cemeteries, they are buried in German cemeteries. And this whole area is filled with the body of those young men who died during that battle. Now, once we commemorate this centennial and those events, we are moving now to November 11 commemoration. And I just wanted to mention to you, because I know how many of you are sports fans, that the World War I Centennial Commission has started a tradition, hopefully that will continue, to have the service of World War I veterans remembered during the salute to service. That is what is going to happen this year for November 11. And we hope that other college, and I know that Tom Jackson, who is here, always makes an announcement at university, at the game at Georgia, about World War I, but we hope that this will continue to be done, because many of those soldiers, those who came back, played in many of those teams. We have a lengthy education program. That is the most important. And I just wanted to give you a few ideas here, because we have been very fortunate. Finally, in 2018, we got appropriation from Congress. While we were created at the end of 2013, we didn't get any funding in 14, 15, 16, and 17 to prepare for this commemoration. We were totally funded through private donation. And so finally this year, we have been able to get funding for our program, but no funding for the memorial. There will be no public funding for the World War I memorial in Washington. Don't ask me why. This is our Congress decision. So many of those events, for example, the Coca-Cola company has supported the 369th experience, and you see them during Fleet Weeks. Those are college students from predominantly historic black college who are replaying the music from James Rees Europe, who came with the 369 infantry band to France and left the only joyous legacy of this war, which was the music. And let me, while I'm mentioning this, also remind you that in those African American units are the first 2 American soldiers who earned a French Croix de Guerre. So the first 2 American soldiers to have received the highest military decoration in France were African American soldiers. We had also an exhibition we were fortunate to have in Atlanta. I don't know how many of you saw it at the Atlanta History Center, but here it is in New York. It's called Fields of Battles, Land of Peace. It's a beautiful exhibition about how those sites, which were fields of battles, have been turned into lands of peace. We have, since we have been funded now this year, we have developed a major education plan with the National History Day, the Gilder Lehman Institute, and the National World War I Museum, and it really will go over at least 2 years. We hope to get funding again in 2019 so that we can continue that and really make a mark and bring back the history of World War I into the US high school curriculum. Because without World War I, there is no way to understand World War II. There is no way to understand the events which are happening now in the world. And if young Americans are not aware of what happened during World War I, they have no way to have a grasp of the history of the 20th century and of all the issues facing us in the 21st century. So here I am just sort of listing. I know we are short of time. I'm not going to go into detail, but I wanted you to know that we were being very active in commemorating World War I through our education program. And so here I gave you just an idea for the metrics, the way we have calculated them. We are very fortunate that we also got a grant from Bank of America to get a whole secondary school book in Scholastics, published by Scholastics. So that will reach a very, very large amount of teachers. So the goal continue for 2019 and beyond. I hope many of you will help us propagate that goal, and we want also on the army side to continue what we did during this memorial, which means to bring back to France young soldiers belonging to the units who fought in World War I, units with a legacy, because we felt that it is so important for young American soldiers, many of whom who don't know Europe, to realize the gratitude of the people of France and Belgium, to also learn, because we arranged for them to stay in French army barracks, to also get to know their French contemporary. Finally, that is my appeal to all of you. You can even do it now. Download on your cell phone the Bells of Peace app. It's very easy. You go to the App Store. Some of you may just want to do it now. You download the Bell of Peace app, and you will have the possibility to choose which bell will ring on your phone on November 11th at the 11th hour. It will also tell you everything about the World War I Memorial in Washington. You will see plans. It will also tell you what is going on with the World War I Centennial Commission. Thank you so much.
Now we're going to hear from Mike Salamon, who is the Associate Chair for Academics at the Salamon School. He's going to tell us about how the U.S. got into the war and why we got into the war in April 1917. And this will launch the rest of our program about what we did during and immediately after the war. Feel free to wander around all of that good food we have in the
Thank you. Right, I got it. Yep, okay. I want to thank Cy Littman, my esteemed and long-standing colleague, for asking me to speak at the symposium, which I believe this is our fifth, and it is among the best things that the Salamon School does, period. They're informative and extend out to the community on a number of really timely and important topics. And Dr. Siegfried set up my talk very nicely with those pictures of the battlefields today and the cemeteries that are the final resting places of the heroes that fought in this war that nobody knows anything about. So I'm going to try to remedy that. I'm going to talk about three things. One is an overview of the Great War, briefly. One is how the battles of 1916 were fought prior to U.S. entry, and if you think about the battles that were done on the Somme in 1916, you wonder why any American president in his right mind would commit U.S. soldiers to that kind of slaughter. And then I'm going to talk about why the U.S. entered the war. So the Great War, Dr. Siegfried pointed out, is still with us. It determined the course of the 20th century, and its lingering problems are very apparent in the Middle East, primarily right now. It seems we can't escape the war about which we know nothing. It began in August 1914 and ended in November of 1918. I have a briefing for my students. I teach a couple segments in my classes on the Great War. And we try to find causes. And I could stand up here and give you, let me see, 3 times 9, 27 causes of the Great War that you'll find as the cause in the literature that has been written over the last 100 years about why the war started. But let me just say that it was an event that was larger than anything seen on the continent of Europe since the plague, that it interrupted a century of relative security, that it destroyed 4 empires and left in its place groups of small squabbling states which were incapable of their own defense, and therefore became prey to a rapacious Nazi German regime beginning in 1936. It destroyed the human belief in the rationality of man and spawned the nihilist movements that spread in the 1920s, including communism and fascism, which of course were already present, but got a nice shot in the arm from the mental hangover of the war. It destroyed the belief in the competency of government. It destroyed the belief that those who governed us were in some way our betters, and therefore they deserved to be making these kinds of decisions over life and death for the common folk. That was all gone, and that wasn't going to come back. It destroyed the view that science would help us lead better lives in the future and might be the solution to all of our temporal problems. Indeed, all that advances in science did was to make the war ever more ghastly. And the losses of life from the Great War are truly horrific. Given the populations of the time, these figures are extremely large, only to be superseded 20 years later through a bungled peace and a lack of a firm resolution of World War I by World War II, which in Europe killed somewhere between 50 and 80 million people, depending on who you read. Truly incredible. Now, the war comes into U.S. consciousness primarily with the sinking of the Lusitania. And this is an event that happens on May 7th, 1915. The Germans had adopted an on-again, off-again approach to unrestricted submarine warfare, and therefore were attempting to sink all vessels that were approaching the British Isle. In any event, the Lusitania sunk, and this event, which killed 1,195 passengers, of which 128 were Americans, It was a passenger liner. Germans believe there's a controversy about whether it was carrying contraband or not, e.g. munitions, to Britain. But in any event, it was plastered all over every newspaper in the country when this event happened. And this really captured in American popular thinking the war, the consequences of the war, and who the bad guys were. And they were the Germans. So, not this event itself, but the attitude which it fostered is almost a straight line to the U.S. entry into the war. But it underlay also the reality that U.S. trading partners and capital markets existed both on the continent, primarily in France on the continent, but with Great Britain to a great extent. And consequently, there were economic disruptions, and these created national tensions between the disruptors, e.g. the Germans, and their attempts at quarantining the British Isles, and the United States, a trading nation, which was dependent for its economy on that trade. And later on, with the possibility that Wall Street, having lent close to $1 trillion to Great Britain and France in terms of buying their war bonds, might actually face a default on that debt, which would send the U.S. into a depression. And so this sort of intertwining of the economic and the sensational put the United States on the course that is realized in April of 1917 with the U.S. declaration of war on the Central Powers. Now, I'd like to start that progression in 1960, and I want to talk about two battles in 1916, and I'll be brief about them. I just simply want to underscore the ghastliness of what this war was about. The first was the Battle of Verdun, which waged for 10 months and consumed, depending on who you read, anywhere between 700,000 and 1 million casualties. In terms of fatalities, probably 250,000 French and 250,000 German over 10 months. It was a battle started by the Germans as a battle of attrition to bleed the French nation white by attacking a place that the Germans believed the French could not relinquish for their national honor and identity, and simply pounding them there with artillery until they used up their precious manpower reserves. Anybody who has studied anything about the military knows that battles of attrition can be double-edged swords. And so it was for the Germans, whose losses after unequaled those of the French. It was the longest battle in history. It was dominated by artillery. It was on an 8-mile front, which isn't very large. When it started, after July it expanded to, well, after May it expanded to about a 12-mile front that was about 8 miles deep. And to give you an idea about the German bombardment, the Germans and French together, with the Germans putting in 22 million, and the French another 15 million, fired into that sector 37 million artillery shells between February and July. And that figure would nearly double by the end of the conflict. If you look at the latest casualty figures, which are 976, and take that out over 10 months, you're looking at 3,100 casualties a day, every day for 10 months in that sector itself. By the end of it, 40 to 60 million artillery shells had been expended, and eventually the British, having begun a coordinated offensive on the Somme to relieve pressure on the French at Verdun, were able to turn, that event turns the tide at Verdun. The French get the initiative, if you could refer to it as that. Eventually the Germans had to withdraw from their attacking of the Verdun salient. So that battle ends. But it ends in December of 1916. The Somme battle begins July 1st, 1916, the darkest day in British military history. So we go from one catastrophe to another. But to give you an idea about scale at Verdun and artillery, on the first day, the first morning of the French frontline trenches, there were 4 large artillery shells dropped. That's large would mean something like maybe 420 millimeter artillery shells, like a 16-inch shell that would be fired off a battleship of the United States in World War II. The Germans were able, for every 100 square yards of front, to drop 4 artillery shells of that size. That size, this is, I believe, this room probably is about 100 square yards. So, how'd you like that for your breakfast? Let's go to the Somme. Somme's a different kind of battle. At the Somme, the British were going to use artillery to destroy the German frontline trenches, the German artillery positions, and the German command and control along a 20-mile salient close to the Somme River. So we've moved westward on the front. They believed that they could do that if they fired enough artillery into a 20-mile sector of the German lines. The problems, of course, were quality control. About a third of the British shells were duds. About half of the shells were surface bursting shells, which are shrapnel shells, and anybody that knows anything about World War I is that when the artillery started, everybody went to ground. And for the Germans, because that was a well dug in sector for them, some of their dugouts were 5 floors below ground. And so those lighter shells never touched the things they were to touch. All they did, if they fell short, was to explode the wire and chew up the battlefield, over which the British soldiers would later have to march. And I say march, not attack. They marched. And so when the bombardment ends after 7 days and the Brits go over the top, and these aren't seasoned soldiers, these are the new recruits, 6 months after Britain began conscription, and also soldiers that were signed up in what were called the PALS battalions. So go to your accounting firm and sign up with all your pals, and you guys can train together and serve together. But nobody put the last sort of part of that statement together, that you could in fact die with your pals. And so after the war, there were whole villages, firms, football clubs, churches, in which 1 or 2 or no young men returned. Because when those units were decimated, beginning at the Somme, those men were gone, and they were gone with their pals. At the Somme, the British command assumed that there was nothing they could do to alter the plan. The men would go over the top at 7:30 a.m., and General Haig and his staff retreated to a chateau 40 kilometers behind the front for breakfast. They had no communication with the front, their wire having been cut by German counter-battery fire. So over the top went the Pels in their first battle. The British High Command was so concerned about their reliability under fire that they got them to march shoulder to shoulder in parade formation, some even kicking a football across no man's land as they advanced toward the German trenches. I don't have to paint a picture of what that looked like, but in 5 hours before the attack was finally called off, with the British achieving a minimum amount of their objective, Britain had lost 60,000 casualties, 60,000 killed or wounded, 20,000 of them prompt fatalities. I'm going to assume, given World War I medicine, that probably another 10,000 died within 4 or 5 months of that attack. And then the British have got nothing for it. But doubling down, they continued to attack along the Somme front until November, when the attacks petered out and no breakthrough was ever achieved. the Battle of the Somme claimed nearly, well, I haven't actually, don't have to be precise about it and find my notes. Anyhow, don't have to do that. The British lost about 500,000 casualties, and the French lost, I believe, 165,000 casualties. The Germans lost about 500,000 casualties in that 4-month sector. Now, I did the calculations on the British casualties on the first 5 hours, and the British had 200 men down every minute for 5 hours. 200 men a minute fall for every minute over 5 hours. I think of it. There's some anecdotal data that's always interesting to find in first-hand accounts of the German machine gunners actually stopping firing. If they couldn't do it, it was too much like slaughter to them. They couldn't do it anymore. Some getting up in the trenches and going like that to the British, go back, go back. Some other British continued to move them down, like rows of wheat. So that's the war when we come into 1917. And it's not a very pretty war at all, you know. So in 1917, I want to start off that year with the idea that the Germans begin quickly again unrestricted submarine warfare. They know the U.S. is going to enter the war. They can do the math on the economic consequences of a British and French default on the U.S. loans. And so they know that the U.S. is going to come in and is looking for an excuse to it, and believe they can resume unrestricted submarine warfare and turn the tide on the battlefront in Europe before the U.S. can come in and make an impact. And so they begin, again, this campaign of rapacious anti-submarine warfare. They also get a little frisky with their diplomacy. And on the 19th of January, they sent a telegram from the foreign minister, I believe his name was Alfred, I know his name is Zimmerman, I think his first name is Alfred, to his ambassador in Mexico City. The infamous Zimmerman telegram, about which Barbara Tuchman wrote a magnificent book, in which Zimmerman is asking his ambassador to begin talks with Mexico and Japan about entering the war against the United States. Japan, of course, in the Pacific, against U.S. Pacific interests, and Mexico along the southern border of the United States. This is intercepted by British intelligence and cryptographers, and it is published in virtually every newspaper in the country on the 28th of February of 1917. So in the period leading up to that publication, the Germans had resumed unrestricted submarine warfare. They sunk a number of U.S. ships. Wilson had addressed Congress asking for authority to arm merchant ships, and he asked for authority for sort of a war preparation kind of authorization. And the day after the Germans sink a British ship called the Laconia, Wilson states that he had considered that the sinking of the Laconia the, quote, overt act, end quote, that he had been looking for, and to take a war resolution to Congress. The backdrop of this, of course, is March 12th, the Tsar abdicates in Russia. And there's a whole other dimension, I think, that Sai's going to talk about, perhaps, or not, about the idea of Bolshevism also. So you have a weakening of the Western Alliance. You have the slaughter of 1916, a weakening of the Western Alliance because the Eastern partner is going to get out of the war. There's already mutinies among Russian forces and in their navy. And so the handwriting's on the wall. On the 6th of April, the Congress authorizes a declaration of war against Germany. Now, I talked a bit at the beginning about some of the economic drivers of the U.S. decision. And I want to go through a couple slides while we're here. I think I'm probably almost out of time. So you have a pre-war recession in the United States in 1907. You have transatlantic exports then after that begin to rise. You have loans, bonds, and liquidity injections into Britain and France from Wall Street. And then the fear of investor confidence after the wars of 16 and then the revolution in Russia in 1917. Okay, so here we have the idea here is the credit line for the U.S. But then the recession panic of 1907 and the belligerent states underestimated the time. They anticipated a short conflict. This is the crazy thing about it. Everybody was thinking that this war, when it started, would be short. Particularly the bankers and financiers, who said, hey, the governments are going to run out of money. They'll never touch their gold reserves, and they certainly won't borrow to prosecute a war, all of which proved wrong. Monetarily, the war was supposed to be ended because everybody would run out of money by the end of 1914. It didn't happen. All right. So the belligerent states then had to rely heavily on borrowing, and that's Britain and France primarily. And the progressives supported preparedness. The Progressive Party, Teddy Roosevelt, pushed for the U.S. to get into the war. And I have 3 more slides that are short. I'm going to ask my teaching assistant, Quentin Gaddy, who put these together yesterday, if he would come up and present them, because I think they provided just a fascinating overview of the monetary situation as the backdrop then for the U.S. decision.
Okay, good morning. So I want to start off with this data visualization right here. This was actually done by Georgia Tech's own Peter Brecky, and it illustrates the trade patterns leading up to World War I and ending in 1919. And the color of the lines, the darker they are towards the red, the more capital intensive these trades are, the larger the amount. And you'll notice, I want you to focus on the density of these networks as time goes on. And right before the war comes, you see a big drop off in Europe in terms of internal trade and their other trades. But if you notice, the United States, the trade networks, especially between Britain, remain intact. And these become increasingly important as Britain starts to run out of money. So the United Kingdom initially thought that they would be able to sit back on their aisle and fund the war through their reserves. And London was the capital of international trade and commerce. The pound was the dominant international currency and reserve currency, but their money supply started to dwindle. And as time goes on, they start switching over to Wall Street for more finance. And so throughout this time, transatlantic trade increases, and it provides a huge stimulus for several manufacturing sectors of the U.S. economy. For instance, Bethlehem Steel was able to pick itself up after the 1907 panic. The U.S. Cartridge Company, which was producing a lot of smokeless powder for the French and the British, was able to greatly increase its business, and it actually ended up failing 9 years after the end of the war because of its loss of business. So as we move on to 1915 and 16, one thing that really becomes noted is this big initial loan to Great Britain. It starts off with $500 million towards the end of 1915, and it grows to $2 billion combined from French and British bonds. And what this yield gap demonstrates here is how much loss of confidence investors had in bonds compared to the equity market at this time. And so the U.S. was now becoming the primary credit backstop for the war. And this started to increase, and in today's worth, that $2 billion of U.S. government investment is well over $500 billion. And this escalated further in 1917. So after the initial revolutions in Russia, there was fear of Russian defaults on that debt, which actually came true after the October Revolution in 1917. That was $5 billion, which was the greatest default at that time, which is well over $1 trillion in today's money. And investors were really starting to lose hope that Western Europe could pull out of this as victorious. It started looking more apparent that Germany would be the victors, And if this was the case, then that loan would, all that debt would be defaulted on the U.S., and that was unacceptable. J.P. Morgan himself, throughout the period of neutrality, had $2.3 billion sunk costs in the war, and so he had a lot riding on that as well. And so because of the United States' role as global creditor, if all those defaulted, the economy would crash, and they really had to go in there to intervene to make sure that the Allies ended up winning and that they would get their money back.
Thank you, Clint. And that's the economic argument portion of it. The scene set, what was the aftermath of the U.S. declaring war? Well, if the Cincinnati Enquirer went back and took a retrospective of the time in Cincinnati, which has a large German-American population, you saw German language teaching halted in schools. You saw German philosophy and art, music removed from schools for 40 years before the war started, from that period. And the belief that it was poisoning the minds of young Americans while other Americans were fighting the Germans on the battlefield. Street names were changed. I believe that the Frankfurter was changed to the hot dog, but I'm not sure it happened in that period. Of course, we have in our own lifetimes the freedom fries embarrassment. And so the country was ready for war, and the Germans gave them ample reason to take that step. So thank you very much for your time.